Testing, one, two, three. Testing.
That's what you sound like.
I like it. What's up, man?
How you doing?
Nice to meet you. Where you coming out of?
I'm in Portland, Oregon, so I'm
Oh,
always getting my time zones confused. I'm also working with people in New York and Ukraine and Sierra Leone right now, so it's like sort of all
yeah.
over the.
That's a lot of action. I actually always get the West Coast time zone screwed up. I don't know how I do it. I can remember all the others, but for some reason, it just turns into just a quagmire of weird soup.
I've
So,
been listening to you all morning. It's interesting to like see you live and in
oh,
person.
cool. Yeah, yeah.
Now it's your fault that I'm apparently going to go down a Divot Johnny rabbit hole, who's someone I wasn't familiar with, but I got to your interview with him and was like, all right, let's go check that out, and wow.
It's
Yeah.
good. Yeah, it's really good. Yeah, that's one of my incarnations is to do the jazz interviews, but I also do a whole lot of interviews with people all over the world. So it's two separate ventricles. But yeah, no, Johnny's great. And a lot of these people will reach out to me from around the globe and they just haven't had a lot of exposure. And when I listen to them, I'm like, man, this is great. And the story's great. Just shows how the art form has spread all over the world. It's pretty inspiring.
Yeah. Whenever there's a band led by a drummer, the time signatures are going to be all over the place.
Yeah,
So
right.
you got to be in the right, for me, I got to be in the right mindset for it. But once I lock in, yeah.
There was a cat years ago, a Latin cat, and his name's going to come to me later, but he told me that Miles Davis always started with the drummer. He picked the drummer and built around it. So there's your beginning of the Tony Williams dynasty.
There you go.
So, well, cool, man. It's great to meet you. And before we get into your life, you have a very interesting trajectory here. I want to know how you survived COVID. How did you get through the time period, and how has it changed you now that we're coming out of it?
Well, so that isn't actually sort of an interesting story. My wife is from New Jersey, and I spent all of my adult life and professional career in New York, and then we were visiting out west one year for Christmas, and my sister sort of pointed out, like, I have kids, and our parents are getting older, and like, you need to come here and help me. And we have that kind of relationship. I took that seriously, and so we ended up moving out here out to Portland to be near my family and be able to sort of help out. We live like directly in between my parents and my sister. So we have sort of equal access in either direction. And then COVID happened, and my parents are both, elderly and immune compromised. And my father had pneumonia in August of 2020 and was in the hospital for 5 days in August of 2020 with pneumonia, when there was no way he didn't have COVID. I mean, he
Yeah.
was obviously going to die on FaceTime. And that was a very intense experience. I was sort of the only person that went to the grocery store for a year and a half.
Wow.
Just sort of trying to keep everybody. My wife and I had a child in January of 2019, so we've got a baby. It was just, so it was a high intensity time in terms of sort of um you know being willing to sort of like take some of that stuff on the shoulders, but also like that was exactly what we came here for, and it ended up being more important sooner than we possibly could have realized.
Yeah.
So I'm lucky enough to be able to work from home. As a filmmaker, I do a lot of editing work and tech work and stuff like that. So obviously all of our shoots got postponed or canceled or sort of put on hold. A lot of things moved on to Zoom. As you know, running a podcast, a lot of sort of Zoom. I mean, that Zoom interviews for podcasts were not nearly as common as they are now.
Yeah.
So a lot of things moved online, and I was lucky enough to be able to actually make that move and maintain a lot of what I was doing, maintain a lot of my work. So it changed me really in terms of, it brought them sort of the vague mortality of my elderly family members into extremely sharp focus.
Yeah.
Uh, but that's what we do, right? I mean, they have supported me in my vulnerable times, right? And this is what we do,
Yep.
so it's sort of it was a focus, but it's also sort of a resolve, a long-term sort of, this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, you know.
Really brings a circle of life into focus for sure. You know, um, so let's get to the absolute essence of what you do for a living daily. I'm going to put you in front of a bunch of third graders at a career day. One of the kids looks up and says, "Hey, What do you do for a living? How would you answer that child?
Help you tell your story.
Okay. So, yeah, no, go ahead.
Well, that's, a lot of what I do as a documentary filmmaker. I was a journalist before I started really doing films, and doing a lot of like daily news work, and working for CBS News and the sort of global hub where you're updating every 15 minutes, and trying to sort of keep a hold of things, and the first draft of history, and all of those, that kind of stuff, right? That's very real, and it's an interesting, intense, hard place to live. But it's also, there's only certain people in this world who can sort of edit, or work on stories about an elementary school shooting all day, and then like just go home and be a normal human being.
Yeah.
Around the 10th anniversary of 9/11, I did 2 days of B-roll edits where I was taking the raw B-roll and going back in and pulling jumpers out of it so we could put it in, to the news. And they were trying to sort of find fresh B-roll. Well, what that meant was I watched people jump from those buildings for 2 days. Like, I walked home after the second day and I just cried I walked for 6 miles or something. I just cried. It's one of those, like, and you do sort of reach a point where you're like, you have to either become one person or the other, if you're going to stay in that business. And some
Yeah.
people can do that and go home and sort of engage with their spouse. And I just was not one of those kind of people. So I kind of had to figure out a new way to sort of move. And what I found was that a lot of times what we're doing in the news is taking other people's words and reinterpreting them, not necessarily to you're trying to get it as close to what they said as possible, but you're really restricted around time and attention, and people want to sort of get a story in 60 seconds max and keep it moving. And if they want to know more about it, they'll go find a podcast. So you're sort of limited by the nature of the medium in a way that means that you end up rewriting people a lot. And
Yeah.
one of the really nice things about documentary is that I can bring a camera and I can point it at you and I can hear what you say, and then I don't have to rewrite it in my own words. So a lot of times what I'm doing documentaries about are just things that I'm interested in for whatever reason, and I want to explore, an excuse to explore it more, and you're sort of making the judgment that there's not a lot of information about this particular thing, or there's a perspective on this that isn't really available to people. So you're going to go and sort of highlight that thing, and now, so I will go and I'm interviewing people. We've done a lot of work around criminal justice and racial justice. And so, I'm going to go and interview people who've done a lot of time in prison, and, or I spend a lot of time working with the Attica brothers. A lot of these guys are in their 70s now. They're Black and Puerto Rican, and they grew up in a different universe than most of us can imagine, right? So, rather than rewriting their words and rewriting their perspectives and the stories they've told me, I can just film them.
Yeah.
And then I can go and edit their material together in a way that I do think is tenable and makes sense. Like,
Yeah.
not very many people tell a tight 5, right? Have a good story they could do in a tight 2, so there is a value to sort of editing, but it's not an actual rewriting. You can, of course, rewrite in the edit, but that's something that I'm very careful not to do. And I tend to work with my subjects in a way that I'm not necessarily like taking music notes, but I do want you to feel like you've been well represented. I do
Yeah.
want you to feel like you've been honestly represented. And a lot of times I'm not really doing expose work. I'm sort of doing perspective work and archive work and analysis work that is not necessarily about, saying, but what about this or what about that? I'm sort of freed from having to do that both sides thing. But along with doing that, if you are going to tell someone's story, it's very important that you take it seriously and you give them an opportunity to sort of have their thoughts, give you their thoughts, and not be surprised by the work that you're doing.
So what did you want to be when you were in the third grade? What was your dream?
I wanted to be a linebacker for the Chicago Bulls or Bears.
Oh,
Bulls.
cool.
Boy, that was a long time ago. I mean, those guys were that was just the most amazing thing I'd ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
I sort of learned about football around that age, and just sort of became very excited about it. And then later, when I actually tried to play it with a group of other people and not just by myself in the yard, when I put that up against the marketplace, it turned out I was not I didn't quite have the motor skills to be a top shelf linebacker.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it was a fun fantasy for a time.
Absolutely it is. So take me back to where you were born and raised, and how did these seeds of being a storyteller, a journalist, a filmmaker, podcast host, how did all that become you?
Well, I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, so actually not far from Kansas City, and all my
Yeah.
memories of Kansas City are, I don't know if you talk about Kansas City very much on your show, but
Yeah, I do. Absolutely. Yeah.
all my memories of Kansas City are just they're all great because they're all sort of like you're going to see a Chiefs game, or
Yeah.
you're going to like, right, and everybody's like, we're gonna go to Gates Barbecue, and then you get there and you meet the person from Kansas City and they're like, no, we're gonna go to a gas station, and you're like,
Yeah,
you're
that's
getting
right.
barbecue from a gas station? No, not from the gas station. Behind the gas station, a guy made a grill out of a tuba, and you're like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
I just, my memories of Kansas City are all really beautiful. So, and part of it was because Wichita just seemed very boring relative to it. But I grew up in a sort of weird family, and a very artistic family, a very sort of intellectual family, a very big union organizers, and that kind of stuff. My grandfathers, all the men in my family, all worked at Boeing Aircraft and all complained about it constantly. So it was sort of, it just was not, it was just an environment that always felt like there was something else, and because I think I was from a family of people who are sort of not common Wichita, sort of like church going, Chamber of Commerce members or whatever
Yeah.
normal people were in the 80s. I think that really sort of put me in tune to people that feel out of step, with their surroundings, with their society. But what was interesting about my family is if you ask them sort of why, what their complaints were, they all had very distinct, they could all like rattle on for hours and hours about all of their analysis about what was wrong with, the government and so on and so forth. And, my grandparents were all Okies and big FDR fans, and really felt like and then they all signed up for the war, and volunteered for the war effort when World War II happened because they felt like they had been basically sort of saved from starvation by FDR. But then, of course, as we know in American history, their kids were all like, those guys are all racist and they don't really mean it. And right. So there was that sort of generational divide that I was born into. And it's just these conversations were ongoing and really intense, but sort of there was never a sense of like this was settled. And I think that's a lot of what led me into wanting to do this kind of work, is a feeling like, even when we sort of come to a conclusion about, I mean, just look at everything that's been happening with Roe v. Wade, this the last year, last 2 years, or my entire life, or ever since that decision was made. There's certain people who are saying like this will settle law, and then there's a whole other section of the country that's like, no, it's not. And in fact, that's how our Constitution works, and that's how our government works, is that nothing is ever settled.
Yeah.
The First Amendment can be changed. It requires 2/3 of the states, and it's an enormous hurdle to sort of get over, but there is a means to affect that. So I think that the work that I do is really sort of aimed at not even necessarily working toward like changing things in any one given specific place, as much as sort of moving us all toward a place of really like examining our myths.
Yeah. So who's been kind of a hero for you in your life?
I think as a filmmaker, I really look up to Errol Morris, because all of his documentaries, he never makes documentaries that are like, this is what we're going to talk about. Here we are talking about it. This is what we just talked about. His movies are all very he always explores things from lots of different directions, and he made a movie with Robert McNamara, who was called Hearts and Minds, who was the guy that sort of ran and conceived of America's involvement in the Vietnam War. And the whole, Robert McNamara is the only person that gets interviewed. The whole thing is just him talking, and that would normally sort of be hagiography. But when you watch the way Errol Morris did it, it's not that. And then he made another movie just immediately after that called Known Unknowns with Donald Rumsfeld about the Iraq War, right? And like, if you know anything about Errol Morris, you know that he doesn't like come to Donald Rumsfeld and like sit down to sort of learn at the feet of the master, right? He's coming to sort of explore this guy and try to figure out what he did. And the way he does that is the give him enough rope method. And by the end of the movie, McNamara Rumsfeld just sort of looks hopelessly insane and out of touch. And so it's just that way of sort of approaching things in a way that's not obvious. that I really appreciate. But I think in my personal life, there's been a lot of, like, to be honest with you, the last 15 years, almost everything I've learned from Black women. And I think that that's sort of a perspective that I just don't have immediate access to, and from like my Aunt Laura, who's a Jewish woman who is, um, who's sort of deeply rooted in her history, and also very critical of the Israeli state. And this was something that I had never run into before until my uncle married her, so she came into the family by the time I could sort of understand things, and started organizing me immediately. And someone she introduced me to is a woman named Elizabeth Fink, who's the main person who I interview for my documentary Betrayal at Attica. And Liz has really become sort of a guiding light for my adulthood. When I met her, it was on personal terms, and I was just sort of doing favors. She just had some health trouble, and I was just walking her dog and like doing favors for her around the house. But she always used to say, like, you have these politics, but like, what are you doing with it? You say you're a progressive person, like, so you're going out to like protest once a year. Like, good for you. What does it mean, right? And she had this very sort of secular version of faith without works is dead. It's a sort of popular Christian saying that I've always really admired. It's this idea of sort of it's one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to do it. And Liz really organized me in a big way to go from sort of, trying to sort of think about the work that I, think about my sort of creative work as being involved in a larger struggle, as opposed to sort of like thinking about what I as an individual can do day to day in sort of different ways about behind the camera, and different ways of who I'm sort of engaging in the work that I'm engaging in, and making sure that that work actually has at least a potential to do some sort of good for people in the world, and to use privilege, which is a
Yeah,
very hard lesson to learn.
for
you
sure.
know
What was the first film you saw that blew you away, that really inspired you to maybe make film one day?
I think, I mean, we just used to watch Goodfellas over and over and over and over. And like, none of us sort of dreamt of my friend Jason Bailey, who I do A Very Good Year with, movie podcast called A Very Good Year. He's a critic, and he writes for Times and Vanity Fair and all these other places, but like, he was the first person to sort of make me like watch movies and be like, no, 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 like this, really, this will really blow your mind. And we just watched Goodfellas came out. I think I was 14. He was 15. And we just watched that movie over and over and over and over. And it wasn't even necessarily that we were trying to emulate it, or like even think that we could, as much as just the energy
Yeah,
in the movie. And we've been trying to figure out how to get that kind of energy into a movie ever since. A few years later, Pulp Fiction comes out. And it's it's a similar thing where, like, even when nothing's really happening, even when people are just sort of talking, there's a sort of tension and an energy and a potential to it that is, extremely hard to accomplish in any medium. In
yeah,
music, it's very hard to sort of set up like that. There's a band called Godspeed You Black Emperor, that I really love. That's a Canadian
yeah.
band that's like 25 pieces. You know them?
Oh yeah,
I mean, like, they do 30-minute songs,
yeah.
and like
It's intense.
the way they build the tension and
Oh
the
man,
release is just, that's the shit that, like, that's what I've, have always been trying to sort of accomplish. And I think in a lot of ways I got there with the Betrayal at Attica movie. But it's very, very hard to accomplish. And I think a lot of that starts with sort of Goodfellas,
yeah,
to be honest with you.
yeah. So, if you can meet any filmmaker alive today and pick their brain, who would it be?
Oh, that's a great question. It changes week by week depending on what I watched last week. But I think probably, you know, there's a filmmaker named Kirby Dick who I really like a lot. No, you know what the answer is right now? It's Boots Riley. The
Nice.
answer today is Boots Riley. Have you had a chance to watch I'm a Virgo yet?
I haven't. No, I know of him though.
So he's he was a rapper and a musician for a long time. He was part of a group called the Coup. He was the main rapper for a group called the Coup. and just a genius, you know, sort of lyricist and performer and all this other stuff. Also like super anti-government, you know, like always sort of remained a little bit underground. But then he started making movies, you know, and he started making TV shows. And what I would want to talk to him about, because I'm a very literal person. Like it took me until my 40s to start working with subtext. You know, like I said, I was in the news for a while, right?
Yeah.
And what I really like about him, you know, a lot more people have probably seen like the, you know, the Peel movies, you know, Get Out and you know, Us and stuff like that, right? Where like there's something absurd in there, you know, where there's something that sort of goes, that is unpredictable and unreal, you know, in a news sort of sense. And Boots Riley is doing that even more aggressively and just as successfully. And I think that's what I would want to ask about, is like, how do you bake something like that into your work in a way that actually is successful? Because I feel like when I try to experiment with things that are too abstract, they just go off the rails. So I'm interested. That's something that I need to learn, I think, for the sort of last third of my career, is how to sort of start engaging with the abstract.
Yeah. What is the motivator for you every day to do the work that you do? What is the love of storytelling that fuels you?
I think that it's the love of storytelling is what makes it, is the sauce, is what makes it fun. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? But if it didn't have utility, I don't think I would do it. I think that it's the utility that is actually the driver, that is actually the fuel and the driver. And the utility, you know, when I was probably 14 or so, I found a stash of books that my uncle had left in my grandparents' house when he moved away. I found books, and it's just a stack of all these old Allen Ginsberg like first edition pocketbooks, right? And like Lawrence Ferlinghetti books, and you know, all these like, you know, 60s sort of beat poetry books, right? And I start reading these books, and I'm like 14. I'm reading Allen Ginsberg, you know, and it just made it seem like everybody in New York was just this like gay Buddhist Jewish pot smoking poet dude. It just seemed like a whole other magical sort of universe. And I don't think that Allen Ginsberg was writing those books so that a kid in Wichita would pick them up and be like, oh, like I don't have to go work at the airplane factory, you know,
Yeah.
because I don't want to go work at the airplane factory, right? Like I know a lot of people do, but like just for me, that wasn't the move, you know. And that really changed my life in a huge way. And finding, you know, my uncle, same uncle that left those books behind, gave me a Public Enemy, Fear of a Black Planet, and he gave me Kind of Blue for my 13th birthday, like on the same day, right? Like here's two things that you need to engage with as
Yeah.
you're growing your brain, you know. I mean, what a gift.
Yeah.
Like, wow, you
Yeah.
know, what a gift, right? And even if it's been 30 years since you listened to Kind of Blue, like it's just as good as you remember. And like there is no better entry point,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And so that that stuff altered my brain and altered the way I think about the world and how I approach the world. And I came also to really appreciate that, you know, the people who fought for child labor laws, the people who fought for, you know, the weekend as like a thing that we expect, right? You know, and also just the people who fought against racial division, the people who fought for recognition of, you know, of Native people in this country. I mean, all of those things like have I have benefited enormously from desegregating schools, just as an example. Like my personal life, you know, I has benefited enormously from that one thing.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean about utility. The fuel is the fact that I believe that this work has utility and that we are creating a culture, and that if my work is actually successful, then people who I will never meet will benefit from it. And
Yeah.
it's not going
Yeah.
to be the only thing. Nobody's going to watch my movie or listen to my podcast and be like, that's it. That's how I'm going to live my life now, right? Because I'm
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
trying to start a religion, but if it is one drop in, you know, a sort of cultural bucket that, you know, says racism is not actually useful for any of us, it's not actually good for anybody, you know, that maybe like we're all happy for Taylor Swift, but like she could divert some of that off into independent projects, maybe whatever, you know what I mean? Like sort of contributing to a culture of sharing and of openness, and of honesty, really, about sort of and clarity about our history, and being able to say like, this is a history that, I didn't participate in, but I can recognize as terrible.
Yeah. So speaking of history, everyone has a perception of you, family, friends, fans, clients, colleagues, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Oh, that's a great question. I think I am a recovering egotist, and like any other person in recovery, I'm somewhat evangelical, and annoying about it. At least for myself, because as a creative person, as an artist, we're always told like, find your voice, write what sort of tell your story, right? It's always about sort of you, and finding what's important and interesting about you, and what's sort of irreplaceable about you. And in a lot of ways, to me, like, that perspective leads to a sort of a paranoia, a disappointment, a fear of death, a sort of, a fear of the end. It sort of makes everything very finite, and makes everything, any sort of progress you want to see in the world, reliant on you. It's not a community-based adventure, and that is impossible to sustain, at least if you want to like be a happy person. I mean, I'm married, I have, a wife and two children, a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. And if I was walking around all day trying to convince them of what a creative genius I am, it's not actually going to be a very happy household or a happy life, right? And what I found, and it sort of goes with what I was saying earlier about not rewriting people's opinion back in my own words, but actually just filming them, and sort of, and reflecting them, and letting them sort of speak for themselves. It works in the same sort of way of recognizing that, like, the things, a lot of the perspectives that I have are not necessarily all coming from inside of me. I'm a part of a community, I'm a part of a culture, I'm a part of a conversation. And if it's in English, I can consume it. That's an enormous amount of sort of the material in the world, and so as I've recovered from this idea that sort of I need to lead, and I need to be the one, and everybody else needs to sort of like come on board with these ideas that I'm working on. That's another thing about film. It's a collaborative medium. You can't do it by yourself. So you put yourself in a position of saying like, okay, I need to go find 50 people who want to follow me into the fucking brink. Like, no thanks, bro. Like, no, that's not nearly as much as good as coming and saying, this is what I want to work on. This is who I'm working on it with. Will you come with us? Will you be a part of this with us? Will you be a part of this community with us? And, there's a group that I work with here in Portland. And sometimes, sometimes that means that you are setting up chairs at the beginning of the meeting, and then emceeing the meeting, or giving a speech at the meeting, and then doing dishes after it's done. Like, it doesn't mean that you are necessarily sort of coordinating and directing all the time. Sometimes you're sweeping up. And if you have feelings about that, if you feel bad about yourself as a person who's now doing the dishes or sweeping up, you know what I mean? Like, where is that sort of, that's not leading you anywhere. That's not sort of constructive thinking. So I think of myself as a recovering egotist who's doing everything I can to sort of connect to people that I think are valuable and that I think deserve to be platformed, and trying to dig in with them to find out what's the best way to platform them, and what's the best way for them to feel comfortable moving into the world. I produce a podcast called Black Diplomats. We open a series on this coming Saturday, about Iran. We interviewed 6 different people who are from Iran, and families are from Iran. And so we're talking, we're giving them the sort of grace to love their families and much of their community, and not agree with their government, which I think like 90% of Americans can understand what that feels like, right?
Absolutely.
And so we're trying to give people from Iran the same grace to have that.
Yeah.
And it's not to sort of, and to talk about these protests, and to talk about the sort of, the place of of women in Iran, and sort of, because I feel like we have an extremely shallow sort of understanding of all of that stuff here, because we don't have any way to access it. It's not that we don't care, it's not that most Americans are unwilling to hear this stuff. We just don't have, all we hear is sort of acolytes of Henry Kissinger and their opinion about it, or the president. And remarkably, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, they all say about 80% of the same thing when it comes to Iran. There's a little bit of fidgeting around the edges, around the JCPOA and stuff like that, but they all are just on this axis of evil business.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, at some point that sort of becomes unreliable narrator, I think, So that is, something like that. I can go into a big project like that and acknowledge that we're not actually here from my perspective. Like, I'm here to learn.
Yeah. Well, that's a great segue into anyone out there that wants to learn more about you, your work, your podcast, your films. Where can they go?
I'm on Twitter at brainwashedlib. I have because I'm aware of the culture I live in. On our website, fifthcolumnfilms.com, we have lots of different, sort of updates and as projects come along. We're doing a project for Independent Lens right now. The PBS long-running PBS series that's going to be very exciting, and I don't want to get into sort of the details of the project because I want it to just sort of land on the world with a boom. But I've never seen anything like it. It's a movie, I'm producing it, and I've never seen anything like it. And you can listen to A Very Good Year, our movie podcast, where we have a guest come on, they pick 1 year of movies, and we talk about a bunch of different movies that came out in that year. And it's a different way of sort of thinking about movies that actually places them in the context of the news and of the culture, and sort of recognizes that, Hollywood isn't like a magical fairyland. It's full of people, and they have to have bathroom facilities.
Yeah, right. That makes sense. Michael, this has been great. Thank you so much for opening up and being raw and open about your story. I appreciate it. Best of luck with everything, man.
Thank you so much, man. I really do enjoy your show, and I really enjoy the way that you open people up. You're easy to open up too. So thank you for having
it. It's a labor of love, my man.
There it is.
Keep doing the good work. Thank you. Cheers.